Okay, this is part 3 of Andrew Gallimore's Alien Information Theory. We are on chapter 6, I believe. Yeah, chapter 6. Um, this is for educational purposes only. The views and opinions of the author may not necessarily reflect my own personal views. There is no medical, legal, or any other kind of advice being provided here in any of my videos. So hopefully that disclaimer covers all of that. And let's get into this. Chapter 6. Quote, far away, a crow caws. The earth slowly keeps on turning. But beyond any of those details of the real, there are dreams. And everyone's living in them. End quote. Haruki Murakami. Chapter 6, How to Build a World, Part 1. A brain sits at the apex of the organizational hierarchy with many layers of computational complexity. However, at its most fundamental, like all that manifests in our universe, a brain is an arrangement of the cells of the grid. A brain generates information, as do all things, by the updating of cell states. These cell these cells interact locally with the grid and through many levels are of hierarchical self-organization. The complex computational properties of a brain emerges. The information generated by your brain manifests from within as your phenomenal world. Throughout your life, your brain may generate a number of different types of worlds. They're the normal, waking, conscious world of everyday life, the fluid and unpredictable worlds you explore while streaming, and if you ingest certain drugs or plants, worlds together stranger than either of those. Whilst clearly distinct, these worlds are unified by their fundamental nature as information generated by your brain. Although the information generated by a brain is ultimately encoded at the level of the grid by the update states of the fundamental cells, the brain is a hierarchically self-organized structure with emergent information generated at every level. The information that manifests as your phenomenal world is generated at the level of neurons, which are the major information processing cells in the brain. However, it is important not to lose sight of the fact that neurons emerge from biomolecules, which themselves emerge from atoms, which themselves emerge from subatomic particles, and so on down to the cells of the grid from which it all emerges. Information is generated within the brain by the activity of its constituent neurons and the interactions between them. Electrochemical signals passed between neurons that generated emergent patterns of information. And as we know from Robert Temple's book, it's not just electrochemicals, but it's also magnetic fields along with plasma. Um, I guess that would fit into the subatomic particles area in this cascade of going down to the micro level and smaller. Anyways, in particular, the neocortex, a folded 2 to 4 millimeter thick sheet comprising around 50 billion neurons amongst 500 billion supporting cells, is the newest and most functionally advanced part of the brain and has the primary role in generating the information from which the subjective phenomenal world is constructed. The neurons within the neocortex form an extraordinarily complex pattern of connections and networks that are able to generate colossal amounts of highly complex information experienced as the world. So we got this arrow going into the dendrit. It's the this is probably a receptor at the cell body, the axon with the synaptic bud. Information going to, did I say bud? I mean bulb. So information comes in through there and goes through the axon to there, I guess is what he's showing here. Each individual neuron is a highly specialized cell with a distinctive structure. The central hub, quote unquote, of the neuron, the cell body, which is here, contains varying numbers of membrane protrusions known as dendrites and axons. So I guess the dendrites are smaller than the axons because this is a huge connection here that extend outward, rather like the limbs of an octopus. The role of the dendrites is to receive information from other neurons and transmit the information to the cell body, which is where the important computations take place. Axons, in contrast, have the role of transmitting information away from the cell body to be passed to other neurons. So, although there are many different types of neurons with particular specialized functions, each has a conceptually simple task: to receive information in the form of electrochemical signals from other neurons, process this information, and then make a decision. The decision is almost simple: remain quiet, do nothing, or fire an electrochemical signal called an action potential. This fire or no fire decision can be likened, albeit simplistically, to a two-state system that generates a single bit of information, with the no fire decision being equivalent to a zero, quote unquote, and an action potential being a one, quote unquote, in digital binary code. When a neuron fires an action potential, the signal is passed along the axon towards one or more downstream neurons, which must then decide whether or not to fire an action potential themselves. See, voltage goes up, action potential, time flows that way, resting potential. I can go lower than resting. Is that like negative potential? Probably not. Maybe the spike here. I mean, it says time, but is it in seconds or milliseconds or nanoseconds? It doesn't really say it here. See if he explains it. Like all cells in the body, the inside and outside of a neuron is separated by a semi-permeable membrane which contains the flow of molecules both into and out of the neuron. Neurons are special in that they accumulate certain charged ions. Here we go, ions. Positively charged sodium and potassium ions and negatively charged chloride ions on the inside and outside of the cell membrane. If these charges are unbalanced, there is a net difference in electrical charge across the membrane, referred to as the membrane potential. When a neuron is quiet, the electrochemical charge inside the neuron is more negative than outside. Maybe that's what this is. Under the threshold is negative, maybe. So the resting potential, that would mean the resting potential is always negative until it spikes up uh, in voltage to, I don't know, I'm probably reading that graph wrong. Anyways, when I already read that, known as a resting membrane potential. Let me see. When a neuron is quiet, the electrochemical charge inside the neuron is more negative than the outside. This is known as the resting membrane potential. Depending on signals received from other neurons as well as other neurochemicals, this resting potential can be made more or less negative, lowered, or raised. If this potential is raised to a specific level known as the threshold potential, the membrane potential suddenly and very rapidly reverses, shoots upwards, and then returns to the resting potential. This event is the action potential that appears as a spike when the electrical activity of the neuron is measured. These spikes are the fundamental bit-like quote-unquote units of information generated by the brain. Sequences of these spikes, like the sequences of ones and zeros of binary code, are used to encode information. So this is, I mean, that's kind of how people can liken a computer to a brain when you put it in these kinds of terms. Neurons do not work in isolation, but are heavily interconnected via their dendrites and axons, forming a bewilderingly complex set of networks among which information in the form of spikes is shared, processed, and integrated. Action potentials are initiated close to the cell body and travel rapidly along the neuron's axon to be passed or to one or more dendrites of other neurons. However, the action potential isn't normally passed directly from the axon to a dendrite. There is a small gap between the axon terminal and the dendrite called a synapse. The role of the synapse is to transmit the information carried by the action potential from the presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron. When the action potential reaches the enlarged axon, excuse me, reaches the enlarged axon terminal, the presynaptic bulb, a series of biochemical events causes specific molecules, neurotransmitters, to be released into the gap, the synaptic cleft. The neurotransmitter molecules then diffuse across the cleft and bind to the special receptor proteins embedded in the postsynaptic neuronal membrane. Here's the cleft. Action potential coming, synaptic vesicle. It's the receptor, neurotransmitter receptor, postsynaptic neuron. I mean, that's what he just described. Dependent on the type of neurotransmitter, there are over 100 different types, and the type of receptor protein, the binding of a neurotransmitter with its specific receptor protein, can generate a range of different effects on the postsynaptic neuron. The most straightforward effect is to either raise or lower the membrane potential of the postsynaptic membrane. Raising the membrane potential will bring it closer to the threshold potential, making it more likely that the neuron will eventually fire an action potential. This is known as an excitatory postsynaptic potential, EPSP. Lowering the membrane potential takes it further from the threshold potential and makes it less likely that a neuron will fire. This is an inhibitory postsynaptic potential, IPSP. Since the number of neurotransmitter molecules released from the presynaptic bulb and the number and type of postsynaptic receptor proteins can be changed, the chemical synapse is highly flexible. Without highly flexible, so would that lend itself to neuroplasticity, perhaps? The strength of the synaptic connection can be increased synaptic potentiation or decreased synaptic depression, or in some circumstances switched off entirely. This flexibility is crucial for sculpting the information generated by the networks of neurons in the neocortex, and so is of central importance in building your world. A single neuron might receive hundreds or even thousands of postsynaptic potentials from the axons of other neurons to which it is connected. Each EPSP nudges the neuron towards the threshold potential, which IPSPs pulling on the opposite direction, in the opposite direction away from the threshold. The cell body integrates all of these pushes and pulls, and if the membrane potential at the cell body reaches the threshold potential, an action potential is fired. This is how a neuron processes information. It is simply a matter of whether or not the membrane potential at the cell body reaches the threshold potential. Whilst each individual neuron can only generate a single action potential at a time, a single bit, quote unquote, of information. The massively interconnected networks of billions of neurons, each connected to up to 10,000 other neurons, are capable of generating and processing colossal amounts of information. And oh, what's his face? Guys like Kurzweil saying like with all the transhumanist, like all these supposed computers are gonna be faster than how the brain works. Like I don't know if they're there yet, if they can ever be there. If you have networks of billions of neurons connected to each other with all, when each connected up to 10,000 other neurons, like I don't know if they even have I don't even know if quantum computers. Um, I would have to look into it more, actually. I mean, I can't really say anything about it since I'm just exploring this stuff now, I suppose. But I don't know. I still feel I'm still doubtful that, someone like Kurzweil can. I'm assuming he knows more about it than the average Joe like me, slow boy whiteboard like me, or no whiteboard. Anyways, I'm rambling now. It's more in the input. Maybe theoretically, it would be an upgrade, but practically they're not there. You can't just turn into a cyborg right now and have an upgrade. It's just not there, and hopefully it'll never be, in my opinion. Back to the text. It is this information generated by trillions of action potentials per second that manifests your phenomenal world. Well, I mean, there you go. If a quantum computer can simulate this, then there you go, I suppose. If it can do trillions of action potentials per second, then maybe, yeah, maybe Kurzweil can claim stuff. If you look around you now, you will notice that the visual scene you're experiencing has two properties. Firstly, your visual world contains a amount of a huge amount of information. Observe all the different colors, shapes, and textures. Excuse me, getting hiccups. Like, why am I getting hiccups when I'm trying to do this? It's very strange. Anyway, observe all the different colors, shapes, and textures in your visual field. Then observe how these take on the form of specific objects that you recognize and how these objects relate to each other in terms of their relative distances from your eyes and how they overlap and interact with each other. All, all of this information is encoded by the neurons in your brain. In fact, your visual world is this information being experienced from your subjective perspective from within. Secondly, whilst your visual world is extremely rich in information, it is also unified. Your phenomenal world cannot be broken down into its constituent parts. Whilst the red color of a coffee mug is clearly distinct from its shape and texture, there is no way to separate them. Your entire visual world appears as a single unified information-rich experience. And there and every time you move your eyes or a tree outside the window bends to in the wind, this unified pattern of information that is your world changes. In fact, every moment of your life, whether you're awake, dreaming, or at the peak of a psychedelic experience, is different from the last. This might seem obvious, but this is only possible because your brain is capable of generating a particular infinite number of unified information-rich worlds, each different from the last. But how does your brain achieve this? It feels like Heraclitus has now entered the chat. Every moment, where does he say it? Shoot. Yeah. Every moment is different from the last. You never put your foot into the river twice, this in the same place twice. Every moment is different than from the last. It seems that Heraclitus has entered the chat. Action potential to the synapse to the postsynaptic neuron, and it goes to the next one. Spikes, bursts seem to be like uh, groups of spikes, and the time goes forward. Neurons fire a sequence of action potentials. The rate of and pattern of each form a neural code that represents information. So it's like a code, I guess. Imagine a small LED bulb that can either be switched on or off. When switched on, the bulb randomly emits either a red, green, or blue light. Now imagine you possess an extremely simple brain that can only detect the presence or absence of light. More of a light detector than a brain. Your brain cannot detect the position of the light, nor its color or brightness. With this brain, you are only capable of experiencing two different worlds, a world of light or a world of darkness. Man, that would be so crazy. When the light is switched on, your neurons fire and your world becomes a world of light. And when switched off, you're plunged back into darkness. This is all you can know and experience. The color of light makes no difference since your simple brain is unable to differentiate between colors and can only select between two states. That seems like cruel and unusual punishment. I don't know. At least I think it would be. For you to differentiate between the two different from the different colors, we need to build you a more complex brain by separating the neurons of your brain into three different groups and tuning, quote unquote, each group to only fire if a specific frequency of light is detected. When the bulb shines a low frequency red light, only the red, quote unquote, neurons will fire, whereas a blue light will only stimulate the neurons tuned, excuse me, to that color. Your brain can now distinguish between the three colors of light, and in fact, you are now able to experiencing four different worlds: darkness, light switched off, plus three differently colored worlds of light. Your brain can generate more information, the color of light as well as its presence or absence, by being able to select from a larger number of states. Refer back to our definition of information from chapter 2. Separating neurons to perform different functions by tuning them to only respond to certain types of information is known as functional segregation and is absolutely central to your brain's ability to generate your phenomenal world. This kind of reminds me of what I said in one of the other parts reading about how our brain has to separate different senses. So, I mean, it sounds like it's allotting different neurons to different senses so that it doesn't all that we don't experience everything all at once as like one kind of thing, which is wild to think about if that's true. But I forget where I heard that. But this seems to be kind of pointing to that. Anyways, in the human brain, functional segregation refers to the way specific areas of the cortex and specific sets of neurons within those areas are responsible for receiving, generating, and processing specific types of information. In the light bulb's quote unquote thought experiment, specific sets of neurons were responsible for detecting specific colors of light. Humans are primarily visual creatures, devoting a large portion of the cortex to this particular sensory modality. So it makes sense to explore functional segregation focusing on the visual system. However, these ideas can be extended to include the other types of information, sound, smell, touch, etc., that contribute to your phenomenal world. This sounds almost like what I was just talking about. On, off, or off, on. That's the off, and then here's the three colors. This is the thought experiment. A brain with no functional segregation can only distinguish between light off and light on, but not between the colors of light. Okay, now the segregation happens, whereas this is the just two, this is all four. By tuning parts of the brain to only respond to a specific frequency range, the three colors of light can be differentiated. The areas of the brain responsible for generating visual information lie at the back of the brain in the aptly named visual cortex. However, much more extensive areas of the neocortex also make uh, essential informational contributions to your visual world. The primary visual cortex, V1, sits right at the back of the brain and is the region that first receives visual information from the external world, from the retina at the back of the eye, and via a walnut-shaped hub in the center of the brain called the thalamus. V1 is generally responsible for basic visual information containing simple quote-unquote neurons attuned to respond to certain line orientations or textures, as well as more complex quote-unquote neurons that only respond when a line is moving in a specific direction, for example. From V1, information is sent to the visual association cortex, which contains neurons specialized to represent specific features of the world, such as geometric shapes, colors, and spatial depth. Further downstream in the temporal lobes, uh, which sit at the sides of the brain, are areas specialized for the recognition and representation of certain types of objects, such as faces or animals. Information in the form of action potentials from the retina and thalamus is passed along this pathway and spreads to these specialized areas, which extract the types of information to which they are tuned to respond. Using this information, the brain constructs your phenomenal world. We got the brain here, your eyes, optic tract to the thalamus, frontal lobe areas, association areas, primary visual areas. This is all on the right side of the brain. At least that the visual stuff is on the right side. Thalamus is in the middle. It's with the optic tract. To illustrate how this works, let's imagine a highly simplified brain, more complex than the brain we envisaged in the light bulb quote-unquote thought experiment, but still containing only a handful of functionally segregated areas. How would this brain generate a very simple world containing only a single object, a smooth red square moving from left to right? This simple world comprises only a few features that must be encoded in the brain. The form of the square, its edges, corners, and overall shape, its color, texture, and its movement. Neurons in functionally segregated areas of the brain are specialized to represent these features. An area devoted to processing color information contains neurons that only respond to specific colors. In this simple world, it is the red quote unquote neurons that will fire, whilst the blue and yellow quote unquote neurons, for example, will remain quiet. The same applies to neurons devoted to processing edge, shape, and movement information, which with specialized subsets of neurons within each functional area representing a specific feature of the world. Taken together, these neurons form a pattern of information that represents the moving red square. It's important to remember that whether or not there is a red square in the environment that you are perceiving, or whether the square is a hallucination, dream, or psychedelic vision, its construction is the same. The brain builds the red square using information generated by the functionally segregated areas of the cortex. As we discussed in the last chapter, how this red square relates to events in the environment is a different issue entirely, and this might be different depending on whether the square is experienced during normal waking life, during a dream, or during a psychedelic trip. Of course, the worlds we actually experience are far more complex. However, no matter how complex the world, all of its information must be encoded by a pattern of activation of many different types of specialized neurons spread across functionally segregated areas of the cortex. And if areas of the cortex responsible for representing specific features of the world are damaged by a stroke of by a stroke or injury, for example, the sufferer will find himself in a world without those features. For example, the area of the visual cortex called V5 is responsible for the processing of movement information. Damage this area, uh, Damage to this area causes a condition known as akinetopsia. I'm not sure if I'm akinetopsia. A because kinesthesis, kinetic energy is movement, and A is the negation of it. So non-movement or motion blindness, akinetopsia. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Anyways, motion blindness. Individuals with this rare condition live in a world of still images and have no perception of movement. That's that's wild. I can't even how I can't even wrap my head around that. No pun intended. Wrap my neurons around that shit. My segregated neurons. Likewise, damage to the areas responsible for processing color information results in a monochrome world devoid of all color. Color blindness, obviously. Move reds, soothe red square, moving to the right. Bzz, motion, color, texture, form. Some kind of grid. Cortical representation, inactive neurons, active neurons. I mean, obviously, it's a simplified graph or um, image. These principles can be extended to areas of the cortex responsible for processing the other types of sensory information and constructing other features of your phenomenal world. For example, a natural sound has a complex wave structure built from simple waves of different frequencies. These waves combine to form the complex wave that stimulates the machinery inside your ear. Specific areas of the auditory cortex are tuned to respond to specific frequencies, and each frequency component of a complex sound wave activates its own frequency-tuned neurons in the auditory cortex. This pattern of activation represents the complex structure of the original sound wave and manifests as the sound you experience. Oh, I wish I knew which patterns represent the complex structure of my tinnitus. Tell you that the ringing in my ears. I guess my segregated neurons for my auditory segregated to process auditory information are processing it wrong or something. The smallest functionally segregated area of the cortex is known as the cortical column, a cylindrical structure containing about 100 neurons. Out of the billions, that is pretty small. And the cortex can be described as a mosaic of columns packed side by side. At any point in time, the entire cortex displays a complex pattern of activation of these columns. This pattern of activation is a specific state of the cortex selected from a practically infinite number of possible states and encodes all the information that constitutes your entire phenomenal world at that moment. In Chapter 2, we defined information as being generated when a system selects between a finite number of discrete states. This is exactly how the brain generates information, albeit using a system with a vast number of states. Whenever the cortical column mosaic selects a specific state, pattern of activation, it generates an enormous amount of information by ruling out the countless other states. Patterns of activation of these individual columns encode all the information in your phenomenal world. However, the second fundamental characteristic of your world after information is unification. Your world is always unified. If you look at a bowl of brightly colored fruits, it's impossible to become confused as to which color is attached to which fruit. This seems entirely obvious, and yet, based on how we understand the brain to function, it's actually quite a feat. The color information of the fruits is processed at an entirely separate area of the cortex from their shape, and yet the correct color is always bound to its particular fruit. This is known as the binding problem, since there is no superordinate area of the cortex, like a projection screen, where all the features of an object are brought together to form the unified structure. The various features of each object remain as a distributed pattern of information across the cortical columns. Each cortical column in the human neocortex is constructed from 6 layers. Layer 1 is the outermost layer, closest to the skull, and layer 6 is the deepest layer, closest to the center of the brain. Since these columns are packed together sideways, this gives the entire cortex a six-layered structure. We got at least 4 layers. Oh, the 6 layers go down. They're across, not they're horizontal, not vertical. Columns from above. Oh, if you're looking down on them as eagle eye. Columns from the side showing layers. 6 layers. The solution to this binding problem lies in the massively interconnected network nature of the cortical columns. Rather than a mosaic of independent columns, the columns have dense connections formed from large numbers of synapses that allow rapid two-way interactions. So a pattern of activation of columns can be integrated to form a unified structure. The thalamus, a walnut-sized structure sitting at the center of the brain, is commonly seen as a relay station through which all sensory information, barring that from the nose, must pass on its way to the cortex, right? Because olfactory sense is straight to the brain, bypassing this uh, the columns. But this is only part of the story. Each functionally segregated area of the cortex, each cortical column, is reciprocally connected to a corresponding region of the thalamus, forming the thalam, thalamocortical loop. Thalamocortical loop. In fact, the thalamus can be described as a miniature map or seventh layer of the cortex. So each cortical column is better described as a uh, thalamocortical column, T column. When a T column is activated, the electrochemical activity can be recorded on an electroencephalogram (EEG) as an electrical oscillation at around 40 Hz, known as a gamma oscillation. This particular type of oscillation is important for the integration of T columns across the cortex. The cortex, thalamus, bzz. T columns. Each cortical column is reciprocally connected to an area of the thalamus, forming a loop or T column. Connections from the thalamus to neighboring columns allow information to spread between T columns. We got a bird's eye view of these columns again, or what? Active T columns form a pattern of activation that encodes information to a T state. When you observe an object, such as a strawberry, for example, the T columns that encode its various features, its red color, its shiny mottled texture, its characteristic shape, are activated and form an activation pattern. The electrochemical activity of each activated T columns begins oscillating in the gamma range, and these oscillations, excuse me, rapidly become synchronized. This can be compared to the way a wine glass can be made to sing, quote unquote, or even shatter if the right frequency of sound, the natural frequency of glass, is played. Gamma oscillations can be thought of as the natural frequency of an activated T column, and when T columns are simultaneously activated, they rapidly synchronize their oscillations and transiently self-organize to form a unified structure, a thalamocortical state, T state. The activity of a large number of T columns can be integrated within a few hundred milliseconds to generate the information-rich and unified T state that encodes your phenomenal world. At every moment of your life, your entire world is a unique pattern of activation of a huge number of T columns distributing. Start over here. At every moment of your life, your entire world is a unique pattern of activation of a huge number of T columns distributed across the cortex and unified by the thalamocortical system. Your world changes from one moment to moment as a sequence of these T states, one T state following into the next. Since the number of possible T states is vast, when the cortex selects a specific T state, it generates an immense amount of information. Since all of the information that constitutes your phenomenal world is encoded by these T states, it's natural to wonder what exactly is the role of sensory information from the external world. The construction of a phenomenal world is something the brain does by default and can be fully independent of incoming sensory information. During dreaming, for example, the brain is perfectly capable of building a phenomenal world with all senses apparently intact, despite having almost all no access to sensory information. See, that kind of ties into maybe these near-death experiences where the brain activity is totally not and is no longer there, yet somehow they live. You know, shed the physical body from the plasma body, as it were, I suppose. Where was I? To explain, did I get this far? During dreaming, during dreaming, for example, the brain is perfectly capable of building a phenomenal world with all senses apparently intact, despite having almost no access to sensory information. To explain this, we'll first distinguish between two types of information that the brain uses to build your world. The world is itself built from the information generated by the activity of the T columns that form a unified T state. We'll call we'll call this intrinsic information, and we'll refer to information that enters the brain from outside, though through the senses and as intrinsic information. When I say intrinsic, I mean extrinsic information. When extrinsic information enters the brain from the retina or the inner ear, for example, it is not simply added to the intrinsic information. Whether or not there is any incoming sensory information, neurons fire spontaneously, and T columns are activated, generating intrinsic information by forming T states. Rather than adding to this intrinsic information, extrinsic information from these senses amplifies or awakens, quote unquote, specific patterns of intrinsic information. Specific patterns of extrinsic information are matched to specific patterns of intrinsic information being generated by the thalamocortical system. Or equivalently, the thalamocortical system can only absorb information that matches the intrinsic information it generates. For example, when you look up into a clear blue sky, the blue light activates the blue cone cells in the retina, and this extrinsic information is transmitted to the visual cortex as a sequence of action potentials. This pattern of information is matched to the activity of a particular set of neurons in the visual cortex. Those tuned to this particular type of information and amplifies their activity. The effect is to increase the amount of intrinsic information in the T state that is experienced as the color blue. Note that the extrinsic information itself never enters the T state. It can only modulate in the intrinsic information being generated by the natural activity of the thalamocortical system. This the thalamo the thalamo I get this wrong, aren't I? The thalamocortical system has a repertoire of T states, repertoire, patterns of active T columns that it tends to adopt. This repertoire is only a subset of the practically infinite number of possible states. We'll see why later. Extrinsic information is matched to and selects specific T states from this repertoire, but never adds to or replaces this ongoing intrinsic information. The brain is not a video. The brain is not a video camera. Yeah, no shit, dude. Um, Capturing moving images of world and representing them to consciousness. Sensory information only modulates the ongoing activity on the thalamocortical system, and your phenomenal world is built entirely from intrinsic information. Where am I just reading this? When you descend into sleep at night, access to almost all extrinsic sensory information is removed, and yet the brain continues to build complete phenomenal works as you dream. These dream worlds usually appear strikingly similar to the waking consensus world. In fact, the only difference between the waking world and the dream world in terms of their construction is that the walking world is modulated by extrinsic sensory information, whereas the dream world is not. Without access to sensory information, the thalamocortical system, using T states uh, from its what? Where did I see that? Non-world by selecting specific T states from the repertoire, but the world is not built from sensory information. Whether you are awake, dreaming, or deep in the DMT worlds, your world is always built from intrinsic information. Pause. Okay, intrinsic, it's already inside the brain, I guess. Is that what that means? Something like that. Extrinsic information gets inputted into that, and then that makes this. Hmm. See how we're doing here. Well, doing pretty good. Get through one more chapter, I guess. Chapter 7, How to Build a World, Part 2. Whenever you are aware of being in a world, your brain is constructing this world from information generated by its ongoing activity, each moment a pattern of activation of T columns, a T state. Your brain moves through these states moment by moment, state by state, and by selecting a single state from a vast repertoire of possible states, generates the massive amount of information that constitutes your entire phenomenal world. Using your assuming you aren't dreaming, information from the senses reaches the thalamocortical system is matched to this ongoing intrinsic activity and selects T states from this repertoire, guiding the brain from state to state. Crucially, sensory information only constrains the flow of T states and isn't necessary for your brain to build your world. During dreaming, for example, your brain happily builds your phenomenal world using the same repertoire of T states it employs during the waking. The only difference is that unguided by sensory information, states can become rather erratic and unpredictable. I mean, which is not evil in and of itself, leading to the often irrational and sometimes quite absurd flow of moments experienced during a dream. But dreaming or waking, building a phenomenal model of the world is a skill to the human brain as developed over the course of its evolutionary history, learning to build a stable and richly informative, phenomenal reality within which you live out your entire life is the brain's most remarkable achievement, and understanding of which we can glean by thinking again about the purpose of the world built by your brain and the manner of its construction. I think I read that wrong. I think I was reading only in the red box, orange box, where I got the blue light blocker on. Erratic and unpredictable, leading to the often irrational and sometimes quite absurd flow of moments experienced during a dream. But dreaming or waking, building a phenomenal model of the world is a skill the human brain has developed over the course of its evolutionary history. Learning to build a stable and richly informative phenomenal reality to build a stable and richly informative phenomenal reality within which you live out your entire life is the brain's most remarkable achievement, an understanding of which we can glean by thinking again about the purpose of the world built by your brain and the manner of its construction. The connections between T-columns are essential for generating a unified T-state and phenomenal world. More specifically, connectivity in the brain can be separated into three types: structural connectivity, effective connectivity, and functional connectivity. Structural connectivity is the physical coupling of neurons using the chemical synapses we met in chapter 6. This is the brain's basic wiring, wiring. Since the neurons communicate using action potentials spikes, which encode information, it's helpful to think of the brain's connections as controlling the flow of information through it. Why is this in black instead of white like the others? See if I can read this correctly. These connections form circuits and networks of T-columns that can be stable over long periods of time, from minutes to days or even an entire lifetime. An entire lifetime. Writing does not like, however, this wiring is not like that of a computer, since synaptic connections can be strengthened or weakened, removed entirely, or new connections new connections added. If activity in one T-column causes an effect on the activity of in another T-column, we say they have effective connectivity, since the thalamocortical system is highly interconnected. Structural connectivity information is transmitted between T columns, and when a T, how do they say it earlier? T state. Information is transmitted between T columns, and when a T column is activated, it is likely to achieve a number of other T-columns to which it is connected. Of course, effective connectivity can depends upon structural connectivity. Activity in one T-column cannot be cannot affect another T-column unless there is a connection, direct or indirect, between them. Structural connectivity is a fold that it of that it uh, connectivity is the wiring scaffold that allows these dynamic interactions and the flow of information between T columns to occur. Together with gamma oscillation synchronization, this effective connectivity manifests as patterns of simultaneous activity of all the T columns that form a T state that forms your world. It is this transient temporal co- is this transient temporal a coincidence of a T state, or that we refer to as functional connectivity. Functional connectivity is the most fleeting form of connectivity, and whilst depending on structural and effective connectivity, doesn't refer doesn't refer the to physical connections between two columns, but rather to connections in time. When, for example, the brain is encoding an object in the visual field, T columns in the functionally segregated areas that represent the features of that object are simultaneously active. Uh, those areas are functionally connected. In a functional MRI image, these areas of the context of the cortex are seen to light up, quote unquote, when at the same time all of the T columns of a T state are functionally connected since by definition those T columns are active simultaneously. However, unlike structural connectivity, which can persist for a long period of time, excuse me, functional connectivity can change from moment to moment as T states dissolve and are replaced by new T states. This is the flow of moments, one T state after the other. That is your experience of living in a world, whether it be this world or an altogether different one. We got structural connectivity here. Okay, we're missing one axon, it looks like. Physical connections between columns changes slowly over days, not 2 years, shaped by functional effective and functional connectivity, which is this. That's effective. We don't even have functional up here. Just trying to count this 4, 8, 12, 15, 16. Effective connectivity. The effect of columns upon each other. Dependent on structural connectivity, effective connectivity causes sets of columns to be active simultaneously. Functional, functional connectivity. Functional connectivity. I mean, what else you want to know? Effective connectivity has an essential role in sculpting the thalamocortical activity that is your world. And as information will tend to spread amongst T columns that are most strongly connected, extrinsic information from the external world is always incomplete. When you're gazing out of a window at the world, the brain isn't receiving complete images of the scene that it then somehow presents to consciousness. Your eyes are receiving noisy patterns of light that the retina must convert into action potentials and then pass to the cortex. The one information that reaches the primary visual cortex is it will activate uh, be matched to specific T column populations that are tuned to respond to the features encoded in the information received from uh, the retina. Why is there the in there? These T columns will then activate T columns to which they are connected, and the information spreads through the thalamocortical networks dependent on the effective connectivity between the T columns after a few hundred um, milliseconds. The gamma oscillations of the active active T columns will synchronize to form the integrated T state that encodes your visual experience of the scene. The visual, the visual, where was it? Gamma oscillations of the active T columns will synchronize to form the integrated T state that encodes you visible ex, your encodes your visual experience on this of the scene. The visual scene is not presented to the brain, but is constructed by it. Your brain builds your world. Sensory information by activating specific T column populations helps to select a particular T state from the thalamocortical system state repertoire. But this is only possible because of the connectivity between T columns. Only a relatively small number of T columns are activated by the same sensory data. But effective connectivity allows this information to spread to other T columns to form a complete T state. Which T state? Uh, which which T state is selected? It will depend on how these T columns are connected, as well as on T columns that there that were already active when the sensory information reached the cortex from the sensory organs. Only a small amount of connectivity. Where was I? Only a small amount of extrinsic information is required to select a particular T state, and connectivity does the rest. When you dream, the sequence of T states that you experience as your dream world is not modulated but by extrinsic sensory data. And yet dream the dream world normally appears very similar to the normal waking world. The connectivity of the thalamocortical system organizes its capacity such that the T states that are adopted tend to be those of the waking world. The connectivity of the thalamocortical system organizes its activity such that the T states that are adopted tend to be those of the waking world. Your brain knows how to build a consensus a consensus waking world and will tend to do so whether or not it has access to extrinsic sensory information. The consensus world is built from the T states of thalamocortical state repertoire, and the states within this repertoire are determined by the connectivity of the thalamocortical system. Figure 1, figure 2, 3, and 4. So you can't even want separate out. This is just getting goofy at one point. They missed number 3, stage 3. A selection of 6 T states from the vast repertoire of states. My God, more diagrams. So matching extrinsic sensory information. Hmm. Being by being matched to thalamocortical activity, extrinsic sensory information selects T states from the repertoire. During dreaming, the brain moves more freely between T states and without guidance from sensory information. How are we doing here? What is going on? Hmm. The human brain was not dropped to Earth as a pristine engineered world building machine. The brain evolved to build a model of the world. The brain is essentially an information generator, the information being generated by the intrinsic activity of the thalamocortical system. This sequence of states adopted by the brain encodes the informational structure of your phenomenal world. The modern human brain builds the familiar consensus world by default, with T states being selected from a restricted state repertoire controlled by its connectivity. But how was this repertoire of states formed? How did the brain learn to build the world we are all familiar with? On a cellular automaton uh, grid, one can imagine an information complex evolving to receive, process, and store information about activity in the surrounding grid. Your brain is this information complex that has evolved on the 3+ dimensional grid of our universe, and the world it builds serves that same purpose to generate useful information about the surrounding grid. The success of any particular model of the world is measured only in terms of its usefulness. Does the model make it more likely than an organism that an organism such as yourself will survive uh, to reproduce? If so, then brains that build such a model will be selected by evolution, whereas brains building poor models of the world will be consigned to the scrap heap of failed attempts. How does a brain refine its model of the world throughout the course of evolution? It's a very fair question. By modifying its activity. The activation patterns, T states, adopted by the thalamocortical system are determined by its connectivity. This repertoire of states is not fixed, but changes as the connectivity changes. A brain with purely random connectivity might generate as much information as your own brain. Although this information would say nothing about the external world, the surrounding grid, sensory information would flood into such a brain, cascading through the randomly connected T columns and generating an extremely information rich, excuse me, but completely meaningless and true useless phenomenal world. In chapter 5, we saw how this corresponds to a lack of mutual information between the brain and the external world surrounding grid. We got rid of that, haven't we? As a brain evolves, the mutual information between the external world and the informational message, external world and the information generated by the brain increases by modifying and tuning its connectivity. The brain builds better worlds that are more informative about the environment. Hmm. The brain's connectivity is shaped over two very different time scales. You are born with a basic connectivity that is shaped genetically as uh, a result of the blend of genes you received from your parents. In addition, your brain's connectivity changes during development. This is also partly controlled by your genes. It is generally it is this genetically encoded connectivity that has been molded by evolution over countless generations. As the human brain evolved, those brains generating more and more useful and information-rich models of the world were selected for on on a much shorter time scale. Your brains have and your brain's connectivity changes as a result of experience, basically. From the moment you're dragged screaming from the womb. How nice. And even before, see chapter 16, your brain is flooded with information through the senses. This information activates the T columns, which then pass the information to other T columns via billions of uh, synaptic connections to the brain. Synaptic connections are special in that the more a connection is used, the stronger it becomes whereas connections from, where was I, connections that aren't used may disappear entirely. No, wait. Synaptic connections are special in that the more a connection is used, the stronger it becomes, whereas connections that aren't used may disappear entirely. So the continuous stream of information entering the brain is not only stimulating the formation of T states, but is actually sculpting the connectivity of the brain and so modifying the repertoire of T states available to, drain to the brain, actually. It is through this repertoire of states that your brain moves state by state and as it builds your phenomenal world by selecting from the countless possible activation patterns of the columns of the thalamocortical system. Through a combination of evolution, development, and experience, the human brain has learned to build a stable, informative, and useful model of the world. This is why the only world your brain knows, or at least ought to know, how to build. And such is the proficiency with which your brain builds this world. It performs this task effortlessly, even in the complete absence of sensory information from the external world, as during dreaming. Weak, non-specific, poorly organized connectivity. Yeah. Strong, highly specific, organized connectivity. Hmm. Sensory information comes in through your sensory information is absorbed by the brain and shapes the connectivity of the thalamocortical system. Eventually, the intrinsic activity of the system begins to stable. Uh, intrinsic, the intrinsic activity of the system builds a stable model for builds a stable model of the world as a default state. The worlds that appear when you dream are not mere suggestions nor sketches of the waking phenomenal world, but mimic it in every way. The dream state, like the waking state, is characterized by synchronized gamma oscillations and the activation of sensory specific areas of the cortex. Seeing a face in a dream activates the same areas of the cortex as seeing that face in waking life. The brain builds worlds in exactly the same way during dreaming as it does when you're awake, and there is no difference in the intrinsic information generated in either state. Hmm. The only difference is that when you're awake, the world is modulated by extrinsic sensory information, whereas this information is excluded during dreaming. Despite this paucity of sensory information, the brain remains active in building the dream world using the repertoire of T states developed during the development experience. Since these states are not constrained by extrinsic information, the dream world can become bizarre, often impossible. Faces or family members become simultaneously associated with distant friends or the family dog, whilst the scene shifts inexplicably from the garden at the front of the house to which uh, to the inside of an aircraft. However strange the dream world might become, it is almost always a more there. It is all there. Get my tongue tied. It is almost always a more fluid version of the consensus waking world. Of course, the same cannot be said for the worlds into which DMT emits access. The alien worlds that immerse the DMT user bear no relationship whatsoever to consensus reality, with a degree of complexity and strangeness far beyond either the waking world or the dream world. However, since the DMT user enters a phenomenal world, no matter how bizarre it might become, it must be constructed from intrinsic information. From intrinsic information generated by the thalamocortical system. To understand the nature of these worlds of such ineffable beauty and peculiarity, we must first examine some detail, how psychedelic drugs in general affect the way your brain builds your world. That's the end of chapter 7, I believe. Yeah, chapter 7.